So let me do a share screen. Okay, can you all see my screen? Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the GCC Global Summit 2021 Trade Panel entitled Building Blocks, the Future of Asia-Pacific Trade and Economy, which is jointly organized by YONUS, NUS, NYU GCC. My name is Hong Ying and I'm the representative of YONUS GCC. So GCC is a global professional development organization dedicated to connecting and empowering young leaders who share an interest in China. The GCC Global Summit is an annual event that aims to promote dialogue on topics related to China and the world. So this year, the GCC Global Summit consists of 12 online panels organized by chapters from across the globe. So apart from today's trade panel, a few of our upcoming panels include a technology, investment, and cultural panel. So do scan the QR code at the top right-hand corner of the slide to register for upcoming panels if you are interested. So joining us today are 5 esteemed speakers, which I'll be introducing them right now. So firstly, we have Ms. Ting Pei Ling. She's the CEO of Business China, which is a non-profit organization that harnesses the support of the public sector and private enterprises to strengthen ties between Singapore and China. So her work at Business China includes programs and initiatives catered to youths, business leaders, and corporate executives. And a few of her notable initiatives include the Future China Global Forum, the China-Singapore Forum, and the Asia Global Trade Dialogue. She's also a member of Parliament. Next, we have Dr. Rebecca. She is the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat based in Singapore, which serves as advisory body, custodian of institutional memory for the 21 member economies that make up the APEC Forum. She was also a top-level Malaysian civil servant and trade negotiator, and was the former Secretary General of the Malaysian Ministry of International Trade and Industry, where she oversaw the formulation of Malaysia's international trade policies. So next, we have Dr. Masahiro Kawai. Dr. Kawai is the Representative Director of the Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia, and also Professor Emeritus, Graduate School of Public Policy in the University of Tokyo. His current research focuses on international trade, money, finance, development, Asian economic integration, and cooperation, and global economic governance. He also serves as the counselor of the Bank of Japan and was formerly the chief economist for the World Bank East Asia and the Pacific region. Next up, we have Professor Alexander Capri. He is a senior fellow and researcher and lecturer at the National University of Singapore Business School and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He was a former partner and regional leader of the KPMG International Trade and Custom Practice in Asia Pacific based in Hong Kong, and he has decades of experience in international business, trade, and global value chains. So Professor Alex has also been a panelist, author, and workshop leader for the World Economic Forum and is a frequent guest on global television and radio networks, including BBC International, CNBC, Bloomberg, and Channel News Asia. And last but not least, we have Professor Andrew, who is our moderator for today. Professor Andrew is the Professor and Vice Dean and MSc programs at NUS Business School, and his research looks at strategy, governance, and global competition in emerging economies, with a focus on international business issues for companies operating in East and Southeast Asia. So he also served as the president of the Asia Academy of Management and was the director of Belgarath Investment Limited, a company that was engaged in international franchising in Asia. So without further ado, I shall pass the time on to Professor Andrew and we can commence our panel. We will begin with opening presentations by our speaker, then we will move on to panelist discussion and then a Q&A segment. So for all the audiences, feel free to submit any questions you want answered by our panelists into the Q&A box and we will answer it at the segment. So Professor Andrew, please. Stop sharing. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hong Ying. So I want to welcome everybody to our session today. I'd like to welcome our panelists, Pei Ling, Rebecca, Masahiro, and Alex, who I just identified in the order in which they'll be speaking. We have until about 12:30, so that's an hour and 20 minutes. And as much as possible, we'd like to have this as a discussion between the panelists and also between the panelists and attendees. So I'm going to ask the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes. And if we start to hit that 10-minute mark, I'll make an indication to you that we're at the 10-minute mark and request that you close, because as much as possible, I think we will try to preserve time for discussion, as I believe there's great value in both the presentations and discussion. In the spirit of that message, I will stop at this particular time and ask Ms. Tin Pei Ling to please do her 10-minute presentation for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Hong Ying, and the entire team for organizing this. I shall endeavor to keep to my 10 minutes. Let me just bring on my slides. Okay. I've got quite a bit of slides, but I will just go through the main points. Let me try to. Okay. Let me first of all begin by talking about APAC. I think this is just a top line GDP growth trend. Prior to COVID-19, clearly actually APAC has been doing very well. Most of the economies have shown considerable economic growth, especially with China and Vietnam. And of course, for me here in Singapore, we also see growth as well. But in 2019, because of the US-China tension, and of course in 2020 due to the pandemic, you would see that the GDP growth has taken a plunge for most, if not all, of the countries within the APAC region. But nonetheless, the Southeast Asian region, or what I would broadly call the ASEAN, would be an area with great growth potential, especially in trade and economy before COVID. And I think once COVID is over with the recovery, we should continue to see strong growth, spurred by many factors for these countries as well. So within ASEAN, I think one way to look at it is that in 2020, despite the challenging circumstances brought upon by the pandemic, the investments into greenfield projects actually continues to be considerable. In fact, it is the largest in terms of volume among developing regions. I think this is an indication of the growth potential within the region. Let me try to go to the next slide. So some of the key factors that are driving this observation that we see, I think key and timely measures in response to the pandemic, the ability to control the infection in a very effective and efficient manner has been very helpful, as we can see in places like China, like Singapore. The government measures to try to boost the consumption, to keep the economy going, to keep flows of goods and people, I would say people, but at least the goods going, has been very important. And of course, for many parts of the APAC region, some of these countries had undergone the SARS in the early 2000s. And these would have contributed to the ability of these countries, getting prepared, knowing what to do, and therefore mounting an effective response in this pandemic, even though the nature of the pandemic would have been quite different from SARS as well. The other thing is that, one thing that we observe would be economies that places more, weightage on collectivism versus those with individualism. You would see that generally the control over the pandemic has been much more effective. So these are some of the things that I think it's also an indication of the individual countries, systems, their attitude, the general way of conducting, society and economy. I think these are some of the important factors that or characteristics of these companies that demonstrate how they are able to respond to difficult times and therefore be more resilient when under pressure. The next one I'll talk about is just quickly touch on would be on Singapore. So Singapore, of course, as with many other countries, our economy had taken a significant hit because of COVID-19. Thankfully, with government support, we tapped into almost 100 billion of the reserves, managed to retain most of the jobs that would have been lost if not for the government support. So we see that the GDP, there is a contraction, but it was better than what we had originally forecast. And within this, if we look into the sectors, three of the top performing sectors would include manufacturing, wholesale, finance, and insurance. It wouldn't be quite a surprise because these are quite aligned to Singapore's overall direction. So if we look at manufacturing, it's not across the board, but those that are of higher quality, smart manufacturing, precision manufacturing, you will see that it has been growing and contributing to the better performance. Wholesale trade, in fact, for trade, even during the pandemic itself, we maintain that open flow of trade so that essential items could come to Singapore and of course we exported. We kept the trade, the supply chain going. And then for finance, actually I would say that fintech has been one of the bright spots within this sector, helping to keep it going. Of course, that's on top of Singapore being a financial hub within the region as well. If we look at FDI, so for Singapore, I think across the board, across the world, FDI has taken a hit in many of the economies. For Singapore, we managed to secure an approximate of $78 billion Sing dollars FDI, of which 17.2 billion are in fixed assets. That means investment into Singapore, I think, and that can translate into better jobs and real and social value to us. And I think as US-China tension builds up, there is a role for Singapore to bridge this and address the needs within the world. And I would say that even during this very difficult time, Singapore managed to sign quite a few new economic agreements called the Digital Economy Agreements. Basically, is as we go towards digital economy, digital future, some of the existing FTAs, free trade agreements, would need to be adjusted to enable this, for example, interoperability of standards and systems, data sharing, etc. And so Singapore had signed quite a few, including with Chile, Australia, as well as New Zealand, during this time to ensure that we keep that digital space open. I will also say that this is very much in line with the digital globalization as well. And tech companies, of course, deepen their innovation, investment and capabilities in Singapore from all parts of the world. China, let me just touch on China. I think for one thing is that despite the very challenging circumstances, China managed to achieve some economic GDP growth when all other countries had taken quite a big hit. I think this demonstrates the resilience, the market potential, even the willpower of the country as a whole to get it going during the pandemic. And of course, technology, as we would have all realized by now, was a very key enabler and also a growth driver during this time. And so we can see in China during this period of time, these are the sectors basically aligned to tech and innovation, growing at very significant pace. I think one thing that we can see is that China over the past years have been growing at a very strong, has been growing very strongly. And for a country to be able to uplift most, if not all of its poverty, in such a short period of time, I think really shows the capability and the potential, as well as their willpower, as mentioned earlier. And it has, with a strong middle class in the city and rural area, it is quite on track to be the next economic superpower. But of course, even as it maintains this economic prowess, and I think it will sustain for some time to come, there are also bigger macro issues or factors that may mitigate this growth. For instance, aging population. The number of retirees every year has already exceeded the number of new entrants to the workforce. So this may have certain impact on its productivity and in the longer term, perhaps innovation as well. Environment factors, the drive into higher quality, the need to rely more on higher quality growth, as well as geopolitics, will also be factors that will affect its overall trajectory. Well, in the latest 十四五计划, the 14th five-year plan, we can see where its priorities would be coming up. I think one thing that we can look at, a few things that I think of note would be that it will put in a lot more investment into research R&D, so innovation, making sure that they are able to be technologically self-dependent, and to have high quality innovation. I think this is an aspiration that they will continue to work towards. Then the dual circulation, for example, with the geopolitics that we are observing now, then I think it is quite understandable that China would increase its reliance on its domestic circulation, but not to say that there won't be external circulation as well. And talking about the focus on R&D innovation, one proxy indicator that we can look at would be the patents filed. So China since 2019 has, in terms of annual applications, I would think would have surpassed the US. I think generally China would still have still a bit of a distance to catch up, but if you look at the speed of it, that means the growth in terms of patents filed, China is definitely leading as at present. So for ASEAN, I think it's quite clear that we are on track to become the 5th largest economy and to become the 4th largest economy by 2030. There are many things that are going for ASEAN: a young population, a growing middle class, increasing digitalization, and therefore the consumption will be expected to increase. Just going to go through very quickly because of time. I'm mindful of the time. So I think all these are basically statistics and trends to support what I've just said. And also with the continued push for economic integration, ASEAN as a market will continue to demonstrate a high potential for growth and innovation. So one other thing to look at is perhaps the next wave of unicorns or decacorns could very much come from ASEAN. This year marks the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement, or the dialogue, China-ASEAN dialogue 30th anniversary. And I think one could expect that ASEAN and China, the interdependency in terms of economy, trade, and I think to some extent the social and other aspects of the interaction will continue to intensify and perhaps become increasingly complex. So I think this is just a snapshot glance of the interactions between China and ASEAN. And of course, infra, estimating trillions of dollars of worth of opportunities in terms of infra, and digital infra will be a very key part of this. And when I talk about the intensification of that link, one way is to look at the Luhai Xintongdao, this international sea and land transport corridor. In fact, even during COVID, when many other routes were disrupted, this transport corridor remained active and ensured that goods could flow to and fro between China and ASEAN. So you could see the year-on-year growth. And I would say that Singapore is quite an important node in this transport corridor. So looking ahead, just a quick one. I think Singapore can play an important role in terms of being that hub and that bridge between the different regions. And I would definitely encourage investors and companies or even talents to consider Singapore as being a very important base. So with the increasing regionalization, in fact, Singapore is in almost every major trade agreement. We have a lot of, in terms of conditions, enabling trade and flow of talents and data. So I think this is an advantage for Singapore. Yeah, I will just skip this and I will just stop there because I'm mindful of the time. And I'll pass it back to Professor Andrew, and I'll be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Pei Ling. Much food for thought. And clearly there was a lot of material within that. And I appreciate you preparing so extensively and giving us some insights and then teasers of other insights. So we'll move on to Rebecca now. And Rebecca, just to let you know, I'll be messaging you through the chat box as you approach your time. And I don't want to be pedantic about this, but at the same time, I really, really want to preserve time for discussion at the end. I already noted like 15 different questions for Pei Ling, and I'd love to get one or two of them in. Okay, Rebecca, if you
Yeah,
stop sharing the
yeah.
screen, Pei Ling, and then we'll move on to
Yeah.
Rebecca, please.
Let me share screen. I have, hold on a second. Okay, do you see my screen?
Can.
Yep, play. Okay, I was coached this morning, so there you go. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for signing in early this morning. I've also started my clock, Andrew, just so I keep to time as well. Pei Ling talked about Singapore, China. I want to really focus on APEC itself. Now, we did a survey recently, a perception survey of APEC. We found that quite a big proportion of folks, we did 7,600 people, young people in the region, and quite a good proportion of them had not much of an idea of what APEC is and what we do. So I thought, it's important for me to just give you a big picture of what we do and what we bring to the table, as it were. So there were we like to say 7 things that you should know about APEC. One, we are a significant portion of the world economy. Let me just quickly take you through. We are 38% of the population, 47% of trade, and 60% of GDP. Now, even as we talk of GDP, let me just share with you a chart. This was done a couple of years ago, and you notice how we're so optimistic. We didn't anticipate this black swan that came along. So you look at our numbers here. As they say. We anticipate and then we plan and then things go. So this was what we were looking at, really vibrant growth for the region. Then COVID happened, and you saw in Pei Ling's numbers how that really affected. So this is something, it's very dynamic, and so we will definitely need to relook our numbers. Now, very important to note that you have APEC, you have ASEAN. Pei Ling talked about ASEAN. APEC is different from ASEAN in that we are an informal, we are non-binding. ASEAN is binding. You actually sign agreements among ASEAN member states, whereas in APEC we have an understanding. So that's important. We all come to the table, we discuss, we talk, we share best practice. There is no signing of agreements. What we do is we make sure we get our folks all together, all on the same page, and then we elevate it. We elevate it to the WTO, for example, or we elevate it to another form of an agreement. For example, the CPTPP today started live as a P4, which involved 4 economies in APEC, and then they went on to become TPP as more economies came in, and then became the CPTPP when the US left. So the early work started in APEC, but we are non-binding, so we cannot have it in the forum, as it were. So it's outside of the forum. So it's a practical way of getting things done. When you want to do an agreement, ASEAN agreements, for example, RCEP was recently concluded, and it took 10 years. I was part of the beginning, the team that started to look at the design of RCEP, and this was done in 2008, 2009. So when you have that number of economies trying to have an agreement, it takes longer. So the advantage of an organization like APEC is that you don't have this pressure to conclude an agreement. So you can have this very candid discussions. You can have look at things from a very big picture perspective without that additional pressure of a binding commitment. Also in APEC, we leave out geopolitics. People always ask me when I say, oh, how do you manage 21 economies? You have US, you have China, and all the tensions. No, we leave out geopolitics. We are economies, we're not countries, so we're very careful how we call ourselves. We are 21 economies, consensus driven. We incubate ideas. So if you, like I said, the CPTPP started life in APEC. The environmental goods agreement that you have at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, started life in APEC. And we're focused on economics, not politics. So that's an important thing to remember. So these are the big areas that we focus on. High on our list is trade and investment, regional economic integration, and added today is the aspect of environment and the digitalization. We cannot We cannot not talk about those things. So let me just say that it is, when people talk of APEC, they talk of the end year, big leaders meeting, 21 leaders come in with fancy, they wear fancy shirts and things like that. But that's not the meaning of APEC. APEC, we have the policy level. In fact, last night we had the concluding meeting of our senior officials. We went on till about 11:30 in the night, and it was 3:30 in the morning in New Zealand. So you can imagine the time difference also. That's an added challenge in this time of COVID when we do all our meetings online. So we have the working level, and then we have the policy level. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to rush through. So APEC also has, over the years, evolved from a very focused on just a few ministerial meetings and only on aspects of trade. Today, we've like I said, we've encompassed issues of digitalization, empowerment of women. So in so many ways, we have made life better. The economic growth focused on discussing how we can make life better for women, for indigenous groups, for SMEs. So if we're looking at the numbers, how many we have, because of this regional economic integration, we've lifted a whole lot of people out of poverty. I talked about the environmental goods that we've done. So among ourselves, while we're not binding, we still unilaterally agreed that we would cut our tariffs for environmental goods, solar panels, wind turbines. So there's a lot of work going on now to include services as well. So making it easier, faster, and cheaper to do business is one of our taglines. And digitalization of trade, the single window, where we look at customs processes and procedures. How do we get to make it easy for goods and goods to flow? So during the time of the pandemic, it was so important for us to get our customs folks together to ensure that those essential goods kept flowing. For business people, this is the icing on the cake, as it were, the APEC business travel card. So if you're a business person, you apply for this card, and you really bypass a lot of immigration lines. As if you go to airport, you will see there's a special line for APEC. Today, what we've also done is digitalize it. So the initiative to create an app. So you download an app, you don't have a physical card anymore. So this is still in work in progress. During the pandemic, we looked at how we can really focus on sharing policy information. It's very important that we understand what is being done across the region and how we can use some of that information for our own good. And then facilitation of the movement of people, equally important. That's an area of work that's going on right now, intense work going on, facilitating business people. You need to get people moving. Let me see, I've got 2 minutes. So Pei-Lin shared this, the regional economic integration. So we have the CPTPP, you've got RCEP, you've got our final goal is to work towards the free trade area for the Asia Pacific. So there's a lot of work going on. We're watching, we're appreciating what's going on, all the agreements in the region, to see how we can then put this together so that we move towards that, the Asia Pacific, a free trade area for the Asia Pacific. Last year, we looked at, things cannot go on as usual. So we focused on creating this new vision for APEC, an open, dynamic, and resilient, peaceful, very important, peaceful Asia Pacific community by 2040. And importantly, it's not just about business. Yes, we're all about economics, but it's not just about business, but about people and future generations. So these are the areas that we're looking at today: trade and investment, innovation and digitalization, and very important, a strong focus on sustainable and inclusive growth. We had a long conversation about data recently for the indigenous groups. And data is so important. Even for when we talk of women's empowerment, we're looking at data. Where is this? Where is the data that would help us make better decisions, better policies? So that's a big area of focus for us. We are pushing for sex segregated data, whether it's for indigenous, whether it's for women, whether it's for SMEs, so that then policymakers make better decisions. And in this whole process, we are WTO consistent. We very important also is our engagement with the business community and with people. When I say people, I mean civil society. So it's very important that we continue this conversation, not just ourselves, but also with businesses, not just policymakers, as I said, but engaging the Business Advisory Council that we have and civil society, as well as academics and experts in the different areas, whether it's health, whether it's tourism, whether it's digitalization, the digital economy. Let me stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. I have 14 seconds left, Endo.
Wonderful, thank you, Rebecca. Indeed, there is one question that came out, and since you finished so promptly with that 14-second buffer, there we go. The question on the chat box is, if the source of bilateral tensions, this comes from James, if the source of bilateral tensions are economy related, such as trade wars, how would APEC manage these trade issues without touching geopolitics?
Like I said, we don't talk geopolitics. What we do is we provide the opportunity for us to have those discussions. And the discussions are very focused on getting the trade going, investment going. We leave your politics at the door, as they say, and focus on how we can work together. It's not always easy, but it has happened and it has worked. So, and it's also not just those two economies. You know, you've got 21 of them in the room. So there's that balance among the 21 as well. So it's like I said, it's not easy, but it's doable.
Okay, so we need to keep the conversations going, need to keep that neutrality, and that all feeds into the issues of non-binding and consensus-driven and so forth. So these are all aligned with the mission, yes.
Absolutely, and focusing on the bigger goal. What is it that we want?
Yeah.
And if we all have that direction right, I think everything flows. But keeping that in mind is so important.
Okay, marvelous. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Okay, we'll return to some of those issues during the larger Q&A. We'll now go to Masahiro, and if you can give us your 10-minute introduction or ideas, we'd appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
You're muted.
Masahiro, we'll ask you to take yourself off mute, please. Still on mute. No, you're still muted. Still muted. Okay, there you are.
Sorry.
No problem.
Okay. Yeah, all right. Okay. I want to thank Global China Connection for inviting me to this very interesting event. What I want to do is to give a Japanese perspective on the issue of Asia Pacific region's economy and trade. Particularly, I want to focus on the trade issue given the ongoing US-China strategic competition. So I have a couple of questions I want to ask in my presentation and provide some answers to them. What did Japan achieve when the Trump administration departed from multilateralism, global cooperation, and particularly the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP? How can Japan work with the Biden administration to promote a liberal multilateral trade and investment regime, which is very important for not only Japan, but all countries in the world? What is Japan's approach to China in terms of trade and investment policy? What is the objective for Japan to work with China? So these are some of the questions. So first, just briefly, I want to show a graph that describes the path of GDP per capita starting from 2019. 2019 is set to be 100, and then the economy shrunk in 2020, and then starting from this year, we expect economic recovery to take place. For advanced economies, we can see that Korea is expected to perform better than most other countries. The US will be doing okay. Japan doing okay. When we take a look at emerging and developing economies, we notice clearly that China is doing very well. India, which would see a huge decline, but recovery will be rapid. Indonesia is somehow in between China and Indonesia. There are different patterns across many developing and emerging economies. Although I'm not showing all the Asia Pacific economies here, but their patterns are relatively similar to Indonesia. Okay, and perhaps the decline for some countries more limited. Now, I want to turn to Japan's trade and investment. Japan trades and also invests with China. Japan's interdependence with China is very significant. And in terms of trade, China's interdependence with Japan and also ROK, Korea, would be large. Also, for foreign direct investment, we can see that Japan is a big investor in China, and China receives a lot of foreign direct investment from Japan. Now, across the tables at the same time, you may realize that still the US is an important economy, even as a trade partner and also foreign direct investment partner. One very surprising and very interesting fact is that Japan, and not only Japan, but many other countries has been relying on China for the supply of capital goods. China has been a very large supplier of capital goods for many countries. So in the case of Japan, about 50% of Japan's imports of capital goods would come from China. Although in recent years, that share has been declining. Now, US-China trade conflict has taken place because of time limitation. I'm not going through this, but because of this conflict between the US and China, supply chain disruptions have been taking place. And in many countries like Japan, Korea, and others have been trying to reconstruct supply chains. Now, US-China interdependence has been very high. Now, Trump tries to reduce it. And there is some sign in the past few years that mutual trade dependence between China and the United States has declined. But still, interdependence is relatively high. This is a graph for the United States. The US also depends on China for imports of capital goods. Almost 40% of US imports of capital goods would come from China. Now, partial decoupling between US and China has been taking place, and the Biden administration also has announced to strengthen the resilience of supply chains for 4 critical goods, particularly semiconductors. So in the high-tech area, the partial decoupling, or in the case of high-tech area, sensitive high-tech area, decoupling between the US and China is going to take place. And that's going to have a big impact on Japan, ROK, and many other countries. Japan's trade and investment policy has been to support rules-based liberal multilateral trade and investment regime, even at the time when Mr. Trump departed from TPP. Japan took its leadership to implement CP, TPP, and also Japan worked with the EU and the UK to implement Japan-EU and Japan-UK economic partnership agreement. And also on RCEP, Japan has been collaborating with China, ASEAN, and others to sign RCEP in last year. There are several challenges. Now, because of time limitation, I want to highlight the importance of a next step, a negotiation for a CJK FTA, China, Japan, Korea FTA, and Japan wants it to be high standard. Okay. So Japan-China trade cooperation. Japan, just like any other country, wants to achieve a balance between national security and economic interests. And Japan wants to focus on the high standard CJK FTA. This is extremely important. When Shinzo Abe visited China in 2018, the meeting gave a signal that the bilateral relationship between Japan and China would be shifting from competition to cooperation. That was a time when Trump introduced a trade war against China. So why is a high standard CJK FTA very important? A high standard CJK FTA would include many TPP provisions, stricter protection of intellectual property right than RCEP, limiting state support for SOEs. This was not in RCEP, but that's in TPP, CPTPP, stricter rules on e-commerce. RCEP does have e-commerce, but not as strict as TPP. There are several obstacles to CJK, high standard CJK FTA, but if there is an agreement on a high standard CJK FTA, that would include important elements of CPTPP provisions, then China would be in the position to seriously start formal negotiations to join CPTPP. So a high standard CJK FTA would be a very important avenue for China to join CPTPP. Reforming the WTO is very important. I'm not discussing it because of time constraint, but Japan has been working with the US and EU to accelerate, to support WTO reform. So my conclusion is that Japan is an active promoter of globalization and WTO-led multilateralism because that has benefited greatly in the past. And Japan still wants the US to return to TPP, but at the same time, Japan wants China to be in CPTPP. So for that purpose, a high standard CJK FTA is very important. Basically, Japan wants to see a change in China, shifting from state capitalism to a market-oriented economy through trade and investment reforms. Japan alone may not be able to do it. That's why Japan has been working with the US and EU and other like-minded countries, but there are some tools that Japan has, like CJK FTA, and then Japan can encourage China to reform, to further pursue its reform and opening up. Japan, while working with other like-minded countries, Japan wants to work with China in order to encourage China to change. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. A lot of, again, a lot of material. I really appreciate the depth of preparation and the depth of thought. We've had 3 excellent presentations so far, and each of these could be a session in and of itself. So that's the plus side. The negative side is we've had to ask you to each keep their time on time. Now, Alex, you were saying that you would not have sufficient time. You have sufficient time. Now it's your job to ensure that we have sufficient time for Q&A. So, Mr. Capri, if you can give us your thoughts in 10 minutes, please.
Absolutely, Prof. Delios. Thank you, and thank you, panel. Enjoyed the previous presentations. In the interest of time, I am not going to show any slides. I'm tempted to show slides of my previous publications, which I can do at the end of my speech, because I've been writing extensively and researching extensively on this phenomenon of techno-nationalism and how that is impacting not just Asia, but the world when it comes to supply chains, manufacturing, distribution, and so forth. So I'll share that a little bit later. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on 3 fundamental points, okay? The first of which is that the world is undergoing a paradigm shift when we talk about the global trade landscape. And the second is that the world is undergoing strategic decoupling from China. And what the ramifications of that happen to be, not just for Asia, but we'll focus on Asia and Southeast Asia, and why that is so significant, and why that's not going away. That's not going to change as part of this paradigm shift. The third is that there is a potential third way. In other words, we're not absolutely restricted or going to be restricted to this binary choice, you know, China or the US. I think that's an oversimplification of the world, but nonetheless, there are fundamental changes that we are going through. So let me go back to paradigm shift. So in a post-World War II world, in a Bretton Woods framework where the United States and its allies essentially developed both a trade and a security framework that was promoting of essentially, for the most part, laissez-faire economics, let markets drive primary decisions, let markets drive trade, a rules-based framework that upheld that notion that, again, there was this notion of fair trade, of open trade, and then first we had the GATT, then that evolved into the WTO, this idea of reciprocity. China has upended that system. So the growth of China as a state-centric, state capitalist, essentially neo-mercantilist system, it has grown to almost 20% of global GDP. And because of that, it has challenged and upended the international system and order as we know it today. So we're moving now to a new type of reciprocity. I call this, if we're going to describe this as a laissez-faire open trading order, then I would call this negative reciprocity. So what we're seeing now in the United States, in the European Union, in essentially a coalescing of liberal democratic open market economies coming together, which would include countries like Japan, Australia, the European Union, the United States, looking to reestablish itself and its rules amongst themselves. So this negative reciprocity is, if we see China expanding its digital Belt and Road Initiative, for example, throughout Central Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia, we see this new bloc, if you will, reciprocating in trying to offer funding, alternate infrastructure, state aid, et cetera, for 5G networks, for example, and so on. So we're seeing a shift from this open system to a neo-mercantilist, sort of a quasi-neo-mercantilist system in strategic sectors. In other words, this is not a zero-sum scenario. This is happening in strategic sectors. Those sectors would include things like semiconductors, 5G, telecommunications, biopharma and pharmaceuticals, rare earths, for top end of supply chains and so forth. So that clearly, that strategic decoupling is happening. And I would go even further and describe this scenario as a hybrid Cold War, meaning that trading is going on. We have traditional value chains that have been built up over the last 3+ decades, that between China, the United States, and other parts of the world, that is continuing in the more innocuous areas. So who cares about shampoo, or who cares about soybeans or things of that nature? But for the strategic industries, those are going to decouple, and so we will see the phenomenon of reshoring, geofencing, meaning strategic industries being reshored and ring-fenced in localized or regionalized capacities. So we see that with semiconductors moving back to the United States. Semiconductor companies still dominate global sales. They dominate in terms of IP. They dominate the front end of the value chain as well as the critical manufacturing equipment, but they've outsourced most of their manufacturing to Taiwan, specifically to TSMC. So we see TSMC, for example, moving manufacturing back to the United States. So reshoring, ring fencing, geofencing will continue. In China, for China, will become critical. So China, because it's it's going to be the world's largest market soon, because there's a huge consumer base there, because it's very attractive to companies like Apple and other companies, they will have to ring fence their in China for China operations, and they will have to seal those off increasingly. So again, that doesn't mean that China there's a full decoupling. It just means that things become much more complicated. Global value chains become not even bifurcated, they become trifurcated. For the highly sensitive strategic goods, they decouple. For the goods that are what we call dual use, meaning these are technologies that are commercial in application, but can be applied for military purposes, those enter a very sort of ambiguous gray area where today it could be okay to trade, but tomorrow it requires an export license or whatever. So that means that from a trading perspective, we're going to see a lot of capacity building, a lot of growth in trade tech, and this is where Singapore becomes a very important fixture in the world, because it's doing a lot of things around supply chain, the technology for transparency and traceability in supply chains that can be applied not only for geopolitical purposes and export controls, but for things like carbon footprints, ethical supply chains and so forth. All right, so now the other thing that we should be mindful of is that strategic decoupling will occur not just in hard goods, but it will occur in the platform economy. And we're of course seeing the splintering of the internet, the ring fencing of the internet, India blocking more than 50 Chinese apps permanently, the US trying to block TikTok and WeChat. And we will see the application of values and standards, and these are manifesting themselves in free trade agreements, of course, in the areas that I've just mentioned, environmental, ethical, but now the issues of privacy, surveillance, and censorship are now going to be intricately tied to or linked to how technology can be used and who can sell what technology to whom based on how that technology will be used. So, Masahiro-san had just mentioned that the Biden administration is talking about supply chain security. So in the last week, we've had two fundamental, and I think very, very notable developments. And that is, number one, President Biden signed an executive order for China-free secure supply chains in these strategic sectors, and that working with Japan, with India, with Taiwan, with South Korea, to essentially restructure and move strategically sensitive supply chains, or at least diversify them from China. All right. We've also had, China's just announced its 14th five-year plan, and they are absolutely doubling down on techno-nationalist objectives. Absolutely become independent. This dual circulation idea of having self-dependent feedback loops in the strategic industries. So that will manifest itself across Southeast Asia as companies move supply chains and value chains to places like Vietnam, Singapore, certainly Malaysia, Thailand, and increasingly, interestingly, I think India. India will become a very interesting sort of halfway house for a lot of companies to move. And I have a publication coming out on that next week. I'll be happy to share that. So the third way, very quickly, for the last minute here, does the world become a binary, China versus the US? Yes, in these areas that I've just mentioned. And that's extensive. That is quite extensive. All right. So again, I think Singapore becomes a very interesting place, and many of these other countries now will be absorbing reshored, ring-fenced, and diversified supply chains. So that's great for capacity building, innovation, mercantilism, and so forth. Okay, that's it. I'm running out of time. I will, Prof. Andrew, I can share later. I'm sure we can do this later. I can share publications and books and all that sort of thing with the audience if people are interested.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you very much, Alex. So we'll go till the 10:30 timeline. I really thank everybody for giving us this opportunity to engage in some Q&A. So yeah, once we get past the 10:30, then if there's any things we want to do extra and above that, we can certainly do so. So what I'd like to do now is to take the last couple of comments suggested by Alex, and then direct questions to first Pei Ling, and then to Rebecca, and then Masahiro, and then Alex, we're going to come back to you, all right, to create a kind of dialogue around your points. So Alex's first 2 points were, number one, the world is undergoing a paradigm shift, rules versus non-rules frameworks, and just adjusting to what has been the way in which trade and investment are being conducted, readjusting to the ways in which trade and investment are being conducted for more than 70 years now. Secondly, he's saying about the world is undergoing a strategic decoupling from China, which we might or might not agree with, but anyway, he's laid that point on the table. The third is basically what's the non-binary responses, options to those. So Alex, I'm going to get you to elaborate a little more on 3, but after we hear 1, 2, and 3. So for Pei Ling, I'll just read all the questions to all 4, and then Pei Ling, if I can invite you in. I've asked you to consider, how does this affect Singapore, especially now we're in what we might call a post-Hong Kong world, and Singapore's role as a headquarters, as a mediator, basically as a, how can you say, a point of almost industrial arbitration. I don't know what words to use, but anyways, please adjust it however you like. How does that change? There could be advantages and disadvantages to this. Rebecca, I've asked you to consider, how does APEC maintain a balance? Because the reality is maybe 21 partners, but one of those partners is much, much bigger than the other. And it's clear that it has objectives. And the very fact that each and every topic has, each and every speech is touched deeply on China, even though this is supposed to be an APEC, speaks to that power. Masahiro-san, you've already talked a lot about Japan's role, but now's a chance to deepen your perspective on it. How do you see Japan's role as a choice of allegiance? In other words, is there scope for balancing both its economic interests in China and the US? For example, how is the US going to see something like the CGK agreement, this cluster of strong East Asian nations that constitute 30% of the world's GDP? Could this potentially be threatening? Then Alex, you can consider the responses and think of connections to APEC, ex-China, and Japan. So we can start thinking of a broader scope, and that kind of relates to your third point, to flesh it out since you didn't have time. Now, if I can invite Pei Ling, please.
Thank you, Professor. Well, I would like to caveat first and foremost, I am a Singaporean, so Singapore's interest is always my top priority.
Yes.
So I think one is that I think we all have to recognize that Singapore is a very small country, small economy as well, but we are very open and we rely on these trade flows, being able to do business, to trade with external economies to keep us going, and therefore rules-based. Rules, international order is actually very important to us. So is globalization. And so what is happening now with the geopolitics, especially US-China tension, of course, there are pros, there are cons. The plus point perhaps would be that with the restructuring of supply chain, some of these reshoring, some of this will come to Singapore. So that's a plus. So, I mean, there have been speculations, some observations that some of the bigger companies are shifting or changing plans to move from Hong Kong to Singapore. I think we have heard some of these speculations, but I think Hong Kong will still have a lot of strength there. So I don't want to touch too much on that part, but you see some being directed to Singapore. The downside to that is that sometimes with that you draw attention, and we become a proxy. We can potentially become a proxy for the fights, or the tension between the two big economic powers, and we have to tread very carefully. So for Singapore, I think in the end, we have to be principled in our approach, making sure that we are, fair, equal-handed, and that we are neutral. And I think this is the biggest advantage that we can offer in this aspect. And although the tension is between two big powers, it doesn't mean that we can escape, as I mentioned earlier. So for instance, for us to be able to play a role to value add, one way is to say that we bridge that gap. You come to Singapore, then we go out into the world, the rest of the world, vice versa. Or, your technology come to Singapore, your technology come to Singapore. Let's try to, localize it or come up with something different. Of course, this is to Singapore's advantage, but this is one way to work around this. But imagine if we do that, and if the tension intensifies, one side could demand us to, cut out the other side, so on and so forth. And therefore, for foreign investors coming to Singapore, our ability to provide them perhaps that protection, or for the lack of better word, might be important as well, that neutrality. So I'm just offering some of my brief points here. But I think for Singapore, I would say that we continue to have a role to play here, whether as an interlocutor, as a catalyst, as a bridge. I think we have the role, we have good conditions, good infra, legal environment sound, IP protection, strategically positioned as well. And I hope that we can continue to keep this space open for Singapore. As a small nation, I think it is absolutely critical for us. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Pei Ling. If you don't mind, I have one related question that's connected to this. So we all know that there's limits on capacity to be able to what we're able to handle, either as an individual, an organization, as a country. So as increasing amount of resources are devoted to, or maybe potentially devoted to managing what you just described very clearly with respect to keeping the balance, as well as keeping the balance between China and US, but also keeping a perspective on who we are as Singaporeans and what we provide regionally and globally for international trade investment. Is there a chance of losing some sight on ASEAN-based relationships because we become so entranced by the China-US relationships?
No, I think ASEAN is very firmly, at least from Singapore's point of view, ASEAN is still very firmly on the top of agenda. We are part of ASEAN, and ASEAN as an economy body continues to show a lot of potential. And Singapore is determined to continue to play an important and active role in this area. So that's why, in a lot of the dialogues at various platforms, Singapore continues to, be an active voice in this. And then even in our conversations with, say, Chinese, whether it's government officials or enterprises, we continue to put ASEAN at the forefront. So we do not see Singapore as, totally independent in that sense, but we are definitely positioning ourselves as part of ASEAN.
Okay, thank you, Pei Ling. That's probably very reassuring to Rebecca. Now, Rebecca, if I can ask you to turn to your question, please.
Yeah, we get asked this all the time. How do you manage the geopolitics within APEC? I mean, for us, and we just, like I said, last night we had our end of our senior officials meeting. This is at the highest officials level before we go to the ministers meeting. Yes, what is very interesting is that you have US and China on the one hand, then you have economies like Papua New Guinea and Vietnam on the other. So there is this range of economies, there's this range of different structures. But what has been successful is that everyone has a place at the table and everyone's voice is heard. And I think that's very important. When you're having tensions like this, it's to ensure that the balance is provided within the organization. So no one dominates. You can be as pushy. I'm going to use this, and this is from my perspective and my personal perspective. I must caveat it, and not APEC. You can be pushy. You can try and push your agenda as hard as you can, but you're just one of 21. So there is that balance comes from within the organization and the strength within the organization. So it's the sum of its parts as opposed to just one. So that's important to note. And there's this continuous engagement. It's not a one-off thing. We are there and we've been there for 30 years engaging each other. So we understand that there will be changes, that there are developments, there are external pressures, internal pressures, security concerns, economic concerns. So there is this constant balancing act. And because of that, the focus, like I said, you have your North Star and you stick to it. Regional economic integration, the rules-based organization. We are very strong supporters of the multilateral trading system in the WTO. So seeing how we can keep contributing to this, the WTO reform that Prof. Masahiro talked about, that we are key in this process. We're looking at the ministerial, the 12 ministerial, and seeing how can we work together to ensure that we can deliver on what we've said. The WTO has been languishing, as you know. The fishery subsidies has been going on for donkey's years. The issue of e-commerce, these are things that need immediate attention, and that's where the focus should be. We understand that you have the constraints and the challenges, but focus on the North Star. What is it that we want to achieve as a global trading community? Everybody benefits is if all of us benefit. It's not one against the other. It's not a zero-sum game, and we keep emphasizing that. So at the end of the day, It's about how do we do this together? Yes, there are tensions. Yes, there are challenges. If you go down to the minutiae, yes, but we're looking at, you go up to big picture, and that's where we should be focusing.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Rebecca. I think we're all learning something very substantive about APEC, which, as you acknowledged through right at the start of your presentation, is something is an organization of which we don't know enough. And what I take to you is that the structure and processes of the organization protect it from what I had kind of pitched within my question. One of these is very important, is that you have continuous engagement, day by day engagement. So you're not meeting after 6 months and saying, hey, something to allow something to escalate. You're addressing it. You're keeping conversations. And so that also addressed one of the questions that I thought of when you were presenting, but then I think you addressed subsequently is, would there ever be a role for APEC to expand its remit in the sense of developing binding agreements or something more affirmative? But I think I know the answer to this, but I just wanted to hear your response.
Yeah, we're not there yet, and we think we have the advantage of a non-binding organization right now. We achieve a lot more by allowing this incubation of ideas, this free flow of ideas, and trashing it without that posturing. The moment you enter a binding environment, there will be posturing. Folks will be more guarded in how they present their ideas. So this one allows a more free flow of ideas, a free flow of managing all the challenges as well.
Okay, so one more, one last related question. Is there scope to bring more countries into APEC?
Yeah, I think that's a question that's also quite often asked. There are members, for example, ASEAN. There are 3 ASEAN member states that are not in APEC. Then you have the Pacific Alliance. Colombia is not there. And if you look at the folks of economies that have put their hands up and say, I want to be there, in the early days, India was one of the first. So right now we have 21, and I think we can manage 21. We are not in the position to expand it yet, but you know, it could happen. You know, so the door, it's not closed yet. The moratorium officially ended, but but we're not expanding it as yet. The conversation is not on yet.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Rebecca. There's actually a question for you from one of the participants, but I'll return to that after we hear Alex speak, and then I'll turn to some of those attendees' questions. Masahiro-san, please. We'll ask you to unmute again, please.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Japan's role. Japan shares the fundamental value with the United States: democracy, human rights, rule of law, market economy, and also the U.S. is the most important security ally for Japan. Without Japan, without the United States, Japan cannot preserve its national security. So Japan's relationship with the United States is absolutely fundamental, no question about that. But at the same time, China is a big neighbor, and Japan has been supporting China through its reform and opening process. Even after Tiananmen instance, Japan was the first country which provided its support, financial economic assistance to China ahead of other democracies. Japan was a big supporter for China's entry into WTO. Japan has been supporting China because China has a huge population and a huge potential for economic growth and development, and which China is now. So for Japan, China is absolutely important for its own economic growth. So the only choice for Japan is to work with the United States on security front, and to work with China, but in a way that China is going to change. China is going to change more towards a market economy. Okay, so CJK, FTA is a very important instrument. If through that, China can agree on high standard FTA, or higher standard FTA than RCEP. RCEP does include CJK agreement, an agreement among the three countries. So if a high standard CJK FTA is agreed on, then that means that China is moving more towards market-based principles. And I don't think CJK would reduce the economic linkage between Japan and the United States, but rather it helps China to come closer towards TPP. The original intention of TPP may have been to isolate China, but over the years, there has been a great recognition that there is great benefit for everybody if China would join TPP, because that would mean a fundamental change in the domestic regulatory and legal systems within China, more towards a rules-based economy, more open, more liberal. So that's what Japan wants to do. And still, Japan is an economy that has, economic size. And although Japan has a huge debt, national debt, still is spending a large amount of money for economic assistance. And also, according to the IC's use of Asia Institute's opinion surveys, hearing views from opinion leaders of ASEAN countries, Japan is the most trusted country in the region, most trusted ahead of the US, China, EU, and so forth. So Japan is a trusted country, and Japan can use its leverage vis-a-vis China. And of course, as I said earlier, Japan has to work with other like-minded countries to pursue WTO reform by putting some pressure on China to change. There are many ways of doing it, and Japan's role is to encourage China to transform itself into a truly market economy. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So there's some pieces that are coming together that I'll move to when I have a few minutes to close. But we'll turn to Alex with the question, if you still recall, and then maybe we'll get to a couple of questions in the chat window. Alex, the floor is yours.
Well, okay, Andrew, just to confirm, you had asked me to just delve a little bit more into the first 2 points and then cover the third point, which I didn't get into, or I just want to make sure I'm answering.
Yeah, no, mostly consider these responses and think of connections to APEC, ex-China, and Japan, so we can kind of broaden our perspectives a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to withdraw a little bit and refocus on realpolitik. Okay. I see absolutely no chance of, and I don't mean to be pessimistic here, but I don't think that the majority of the international security community, economic community, thinks that China is going to revert to a more open market economy. I think everything that we see from the present regime is that they are going in the opposite direction. They are doubling down on control of the marketplace. We see with the big technology firms, with the freezing of the Ant Group IPO recently, the new antitrust regulation that's being rolled out against Tencent and Alibaba and all of them. The increased presence of the Chinese Communist Party on the boards of directors of all major Chinese companies, the committees to align, corporate policy with party policy. So I just don't see any light at the end of the tunnel at this point in that regard. So from that standpoint, I would have to say that just going back to this theme of strategic decoupling, in those strategic sectors, let me just expand a little bit on that. I do see strategic decoupling in human capital, in innovation, in R&D, for example. And then, an area that I've been writing a lot about, don't have time to get into it, in the academic world. Where does the strategic decoupling go in terms of academia? And the answer to that is it's going to become a lot more pervasive in these key areas. The other area that I didn't mention, and I go back to China and China's strategic and geopolitical ambitions, is financial markets. China is pushing ahead as quickly as possible with digital currency because it wants to achieve essentially digital hegemony throughout the region. It wants the digital renminbi, because it has to decouple from the US dollar. It is highly exposed to sanctions and export controls because the US dollar continues to be the primary trading and reserve currency, even for China. And it's highly exposed in that regard. So what that means is if we're going to have a decoupling around values with the application of technology, that's going to extend to financial markets and the firms that are building the blockchain and building the financial banking system around the Chinese digital currency. So again, the world is, we're going to see these blocks. Now, in terms of China joining the TPP, I have to ask the question, if China is going to adhere to a set of values that are fundamentally different than other countries, the EU, the United States, when it comes to things like privacy and surveillance and censorship, how is it actually going to join a trade agreement like the CPTPP and actually have people expect those standards to be enforced? I think what that does is it essentially dilutes the rules-based framework of those particular agreements. So again, there are a lot of positives here for the world economy, even in a world where we're bifurcated, bifurcated strategically. There's a lot of capacity building. We've mentioned Singapore. I mean, Singapore has so much to gain from capacity building. There are a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that will absorb some of this, some of this manufacturing, some of these supply chains, and so forth. The United States, with the Biden administration, is essentially on the verge of a new moonshot, right? If the government overcomes political paralysis between these two parties, the amount of investment that actually this is really the only bipartisan issue in the United States, and this is this reaction to China. So it's not all negative, and again, there's a lot of trade with China that's going to continue because this is what I call the China conundrum, right? The China conundrum is how much of your economy and how much of your revenue stream can you link to China without having a Faustian bargain, basically, right? And that's the balance, right? That's the name of the game. You've got to stay ahead in the innovation race. You've got to figure out how to protect your IP. You've got to continue to stay 1 or 2 steps ahead. To use the horse race analogy, when we're talking about the US, Europe, and China, is it about making your horse run faster, or is it about tripping up the other guy's horse, right? Well, guess what? It's both. You're trying to get your horse to run faster because you want to keep running in that race with the other horse, even though you're competing against it, right?
So we'll ask Masahiro for his response. But in terms of that Faustian bargaining, I think a relevant point to consider is that for China's food imports, there's policies in place to have dependence of no more than 10% of the imports from any one country, which kind of is a inverse of what's happened with the dominance of manufacturing that comes from China and the idea that, hey, don't go anywhere else, stay here. But yet when we look at the policy in the opposite direction, it's all about diversification and risk mitigation through the multiple sources of food imports. Masahiro-san.
Okay, just a quick intervention. Well, if you believe that, if anyone believes that China is not going to change, in particular on economic issues, what what is the choice for the rest of us? Just keep distance from China and try to protect, isolate China. That's the only strategy that the rest of the world can take. Now, under the current leadership, it may be difficult for China to change. But in future leaderships, there is great potential for change. And the international community has to express its concerns about the current state of China. And particularly, I am an economist. I don't specialize in national security issues, but still in security areas, there are many issues that the international community would have to express views on, like South China Sea, East China Sea, and other types of maritime advancement of China. On economic issues, there are many things that China can, in principle, achieve. And there are many reformists still in China. They are silent. We have to support them, and we have to give them what choices China would have. So I think I believe that China can change, and maybe not now. So from that perspective, I have made my point earlier. Now, if China joins CPTPP, does it dilute CPTPP? No, because to join CPTPP, all the provisions would have to be accepted by the new incoming country, which means that the new member will have to go through legal changes, regulatory changes. Of course, whether the country is going to implement the commitment is not is another story. But at least, a lot of changes would have to be agreed on, and that's a big step forward. If the country does not abide by rules, then there is a procedure for addressing that issue. Thank you.
Masahiro, wonderful points. Thank you very much. So let me just provide some reflection on his point. So Masahiro is mentioning about playing not just the short game, but playing the long game and thinking about moving into the future. And if we think back to China after Mao Zedong, and then when Deng Xiaoping assumed leadership, even though he's officially not recognized as the president of the country. But in any case, one of the points he made is that they wanted to have what was called, let's say, intra-party diversity, for lack of a better word. I can't remember the exact word, but what some of the steps that Deng Xiaoping took at that time was to was to introduce policies that reduce the power of any one individual in the CPP. So even though it's a single party state, there's still within party discussion of what should be happening. Now, clearly that's gone in the opposite direction. And under President Xi, there's been a tremendous consolidation of power, but that tremendous consolidation of power might not exist forever and will not exist forever, because we never see that. That's just the consistent pattern within history. So if these opposing voices do gain more power, either by changes in official appointees or by other means of being able to express voice, then maybe we'll see more room for dialogue. So that's part of what I take away from Masahiro's point. Rebecca, sorry, I overstepped your hand. Please go ahead.
It's okay. I just want to agree with what Masahiro-san just said. I see the noises or the opinions being expressed or the voices coming out of China about joining the CPTPP is very positive, because as Masahiro-san says, you can't come in and change it. You can't come in and dilute it. You have those disciplines in place. You have to abide by it, and to do that, you need structural reform. So I see it as very positive that to come in If China comes in, the structural reform, the regulatory reform that must take place, it will be good for all of us. That level of transparency that's required, that level of predictability that will be required will be good for the system, the global trading system. So I don't see a downside, but I see a challenge that it's not going to be so straightforward, given the disciplines required of the state-owned enterprises, the level playing field that we talk about in the CPTPP. That's going to be the bigger challenge. Can they meet those challenges? That's the question.
Okay, we don't really, yes. So I'll just ask for anybody for one or two quick points to summarize. Pei Ling, would you like to have one or two final thoughts?
Well, thank you. I think first of all, I pretty much agree with most of the points here, but I think there is also a tinge of optimism in some of the points. I think China will continue to be a very formidable economic power. Even, I mean, with its dual circulation, it's quite clear that they are looking at being self-sufficient, and so that they are more shielded from some of the other actions of the other countries. So I think we have to recognize that, even as it's opening up, modernizing, and doing its reforms. So I think that's one. But overall, I would say that for APEC, since coming back to this dialogue, is that the potential for growth is still very tremendous. There are some key economies really driving this, whether it's China, ASEAN as a whole. I think these are bright spots, and we need to continue to play that. To continue to pay attention to that. And of course, for Singapore, I think we still have much to do. I believe we can still play an active role in adding value, but we are also vulnerable to a lot of these forces. And I would say it's not just Singapore, but many other economies, even within ASEAN, can be vulnerable to these macro trends and tensions that we talk about. So, so much to be hopeful for, but there are also things that we need to tread very carefully looking ahead. Thank you.
We'll go to Rebecca, then Masahiro, then Alex, because if we go back to Alex and everybody else will come back again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just to say, like Pei Ling, I'm optimistic. I think there's so much that we can do together. And I believe in the power of the region. So regional economic integration, the ability for us to learn from each other, to help each other build capacity, and to take big picture stance. I think it's so important. And to keep that conversation going, engaging with the business community. And that's what we do in APEC. So engaging the business community now, engaging with academics as well as civil society. I think that's important. So people and policy, very important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Masahiro.
Okay, I fully agree that regional cooperation and regional integration is quite important. And at the same time, WTO reform is something that everybody should be focusing on. The new Director General came in, and I think the Biden administration would have to clarify its policy stance towards the WTO. But most other countries have relatively clear views of how WTO should be reformed, although countries' views may be different, but to fill the gap, a lot of dialogues would be needed, particularly between Japan and China, the US and China, EU and China, ASEAN and China. I think a lot of conversations would be needed vis-a-vis China for that purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masahiro. Alex?
Look, I'll just say, I've had a 30-year career in global trade, first as a government official, then as as an advisor, most of it in China and Asia. I'm a multilateralist, I'm a globalist, I'm also a realist. So I have to say that dialogue is wonderful. I encourage it. Multilateral organizations are very important. I think public-private partnerships are increasingly important under these frameworks of rules. We'll see more of that. let me close on the positive. There are a lot of areas for cooperation with China, ASEAN, APEC, et cetera. I think climate change is going to drive a lot of capacity building, clean tech, traceable, transparent supply chains around ethical labor standards. These are all things that are very important, and I think there's a lot of room for cooperation. I'd like to be optimistic about China opening up. I was optimistic in 2001 when it joined the WTO and promised to do all these things, which it hasn't. We'll have to wait and see. But in the meantime, I revert to realism, and I think again, there's still a lot of room for growth in the global economy, but it's going to be a striated, sort of trifurcated world of global value chains. And that's, we can live with that. We can certainly live with that.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, everybody. So there's a few questions in the chat window, but we're about 10 minutes over our allotted time. So I'll ask our participants if they would like to maybe put in a couple of words in response to those. Otherwise, I will respond to them myself in some ways. So either way is fine with me. But I think we kind of morphed into a discussion that was maybe not entirely in line with the GCC organizers' points, which has good points and bad points. A good point is that we got some vibrant discussion. A good point is that maybe they won't invite us again at 9 a.m. Because they didn't like what we said, so we can sleep a little bit longer and enjoy our mornings. But the bad point is that maybe we didn't touch deeply enough on APEC specifically, or ASEAN specifically. But I think that's also reflective of some of the realities. Some of the other realities are that, yes, we do see some really interesting pressures emerging on the world from a strong and emergent China, as reflected a lot in this shift away from market oriented towards state capitalism, reflected in some of the points raised earlier about increased ownership by the state and private firms, and increased participation in SOEs by party officials in positions of importance, and is reflected in so many other ways. But at the end of the day, I think the most important point that comes away from all of this development is not an over concern about the strength, but I think was reflected in Rebecca's slide about the number of people lifted out of poverty. And at the end of the day, I mean, this is such a tremendous accomplishment. And yes, maybe we're bearing some of the pains of this through the tensions, but the reality is we have organizations like APEC, and we have the two strongest economic countries by GDP per capita in the region, meaning Singapore and Japan, working to repair any fractures that might exist as China and the US butt heads, and whether or not, as Alex suggests, some of these tensions begin to spread. So we do have cohesive forces in a world that is maybe slightly divisive in some ways, but that's I think a reality of the situation. I think that's reflected in a lot of the comments, projecting both a reality, but also a mature appreciation of the responsibilities of these different organizations to maintain this coherence in our globalizing world. And from that, I take a real sense of positivism, and the fact also that our four accomplished panelists are willing to participate in such a session also reinforces my optimism, my sense of optimism. So thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate the time that you spent, and wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Hongying, anything?
Thank you.
Thank you. This is very useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Real
you.
pleasure.
On behalf of GCC, I just want to say thank you to all the speakers and Professor Andrew as the moderator. Thank you for taking time off your busy schedule to host this talk. And thank you to everyone who dialed in at 9 a.m. so early in the morning, sacrificing your sleep schedule. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.